So let's talk about Gaius Julius Caesar. He's one of the most important figures in Western history, if not human history. If not for what he did while alive, then everything he influenced after his death. It's no mistake that the Kaisers of Germany and the Tsars of Russia literally took his name as their title of royalty, and they did that for a very specific reason. When people think of him, they think of overly dramatic phrases like the die is cast, and dramatic moments of destiny like crossing the Rubicon. And they also probably think of how he was stabbed to death by a lot of old jealous white guys on the floor of the Senate. So let's take a look at the life of Caesar. Caesar was born into the Julii, a patrician family in Rome, one that could trace its lineage back to the founding of the city. Indeed, the Julii were descendants of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who was the son of Aphrodite. If you thought that might give someone a complex, well, you'd be right. A lot of Caesar's actions make a lot more sense when you think about how he was considered himself descendant from a literal god. Anyway, despite being related to the god of love and fortune, the Julii were pretty much on the outs by the time Caesar was born. They weren't particularly influential, nor were they particularly wealthy, so they were basically like most of the other patrician families. They simply existed. Maybe they'd get an appointment to some province sometime, or someone would throw them a bone in the form of a political position, but it wasn't exactly likely that they'd get anywhere. Caesar's father, of whom we know even less about, and who was also called Gaius Julius Caesar to be extra confusing, was at the time able to get a governorship of the province of Asia. Well, they call it Asia. We call it Western Turkey. Meanwhile, Caesar's Aunt Julia married a guy named Gaius Marius, and keep that name in mind because we're going to be returning to him. Unlike today, where people record every waking moment of their kids' lives, we know painfully little of Caesar's own childhood. What we do know is that when Caesar turned 16, his father suddenly died. I'd say this was surprising, but it was the year 85 BCE. Dying suddenly was fairly normal in comparison to today. Anyway, this made Caesar at 16 head of the entire Julii family. Meanwhile, in Italy, a civil war was going on between Caesar's uncle Gaius Marius and a guy named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Like any good civil war, both sides spent their time committing bloody purges of members of the other side whenever they got the chance, and given control of Rome switched back and forth numerous times, it's amazing it went on as long as it did. Anyway, during one of the times Marius and friends controlled Rome, he nominated Caesar to be the new high priest of Jupiter. So now a 16-year-old was supposed to be the head of the most important religious services in the state. And that probably would have gone well had Sulla not won the civil war in the end. Caesar was stripped of his inheritance, his wife's dowry, and his status as high priest after that. For reasons we still don't know, he refused to divorce his wife Cornelia and fled into hiding, while Sulla continued purging all of his political enemies in Rome, as you do. Luckily for Caesar, though, his mother's family intervened and, through some of Sulla's supporters, convinced Sulla not to kill him. Sulla himself wasn't too happy about this, but it's important to note that Sulla, the first guy to march Roman troops on Rome itself, never actually overthrew the state. Instead, he spent most of his time trying to convince everyone else that he was returning the state back to what it was supposed to be, and actually gave up control of the state to die in retirement. Meanwhile, Caesar decided that living in Rome under a guy who recently wanted him dead was a bad idea, and did what many men do when they need to get away from places they don't like, and join the military. Somehow, Caesar felt that being in battle, where people were trying to kill him, was safer than being in Rome, where people were trying to kill him. The state of Roman politics, it should be said, is a lot less about great oration in front of old white men, and a lot more about angry mobs trying to murder their political rivals. Anyway, as it turned out, Caesar was pretty good at the whole military thing, and began serving with distinction. Given that this was an age when you got to be commander based on who your family was, and not if you had any military sense, I'm sure the soldiers under him were quite happy that their commander wasn't a complete moron. Caesar didn't return to Rome until 78 BCE, which is when Sulla finally died, much to most people's relief, I'm sure. Now, Caesar didn't have any money, given that all of his inheritance was taken away during that whole political purging process, but he did manage to acquire Amanda's house, which is more than most people possessed. Caesar needed a new job now that he wasn't in the military anymore, turned to being a lawyer. According to the sources, Caesar was noted for having a few things: great speaking skills, lots of passionate gesturing, and a high-pitched voice. This, as many dictators and politicians will attest, is a winning combination. Still, he made quite a name for himself by going after corrupt former governors, which made him pretty popular among the people of Rome. Because Caesar's life hadn't yet been exciting enough, he was then kidnapped by pirates when sailing across the Aegean Sea. The pirates, figuring that he was worth money, demanded they pay 20 talents of silver for his safe return. A Roman talent was a unit of measurement which corresponded to 71 pounds. A single talent was, generally speaking, a year's worth of pay. So in essence, the pirates were asking for 1,420 pounds of silver, or the equivalent of 20 years' worth of pay for a single Roman soldier. Caesar, of course, talking himself up, demanded that they ask for 50 talents of silver instead. Meaning, he said he was worth 3,550 pounds of silver. It's pretty amazing that people traded in that amount of precious metals during this time period. Anyway, they paid the ransom for him, which freed Caesar. His first act of freedom? Raise a fleet, track down his former captors, and then crucified a lot of them. Though, it should be said, in an act of leniency, he cut all their throats first, meaning that they were just there as symbols and not sitting up there suffering for everyone who passed by them. See, the Romans didn't leave crucified criminals out of the way, they lined the roads with these guys, meaning that when you entered and exited Rome, there were dead criminals hanging on crosses everywhere. Some of the soon-to-be dead criminals were still alive, which meant that you got to see them bleed and groan and starve to death as you came and went. You know, normal Roman things. With the pirate killing done, Caesar returned to Rome, where he was then elected military tribune, which is his first step towards a political career. Yes, you had to do all of that before you get a career in politics going. And then his aunt and wife died, both in quick succession. But no time to worry about that, because he was then elected quaestor, and was off to Spain. The year was 69 BCE. Caesar, at the time, was 32, so yes, he's done all of what I've told you about and been describing in the 16 years since he became head of his household. Of course, all of this wasn't enough for Caesar, and there's a story that is sometimes cited where Caesar came across a statue of Alexander the Great while he was in Spain. Caesar, noting when Alexander the Great was 32, he had conquered the known world, realized, much to his dismay, that he had done relatively little with his life in comparison. I can only imagine what he might think of our lives today. Anyway, Caesar returned to Rome and married a woman named Pompeia, who he then divorced 6 years later. The reason? A whole lot of things that involved sacred rites, multiple noble families, and charges of incest among Pompeia and her family members. I could go into it more, but we'd be here all day, and we haven't even gotten to Caesar's real military career yet. Skipping ahead a bit, Caesar kept winning elections for positions, while other people like Cicero were made consul and exposed something called the Catiline conspiracy to take over the Roman Republic, and somewhere along the line Caesar was sent off to southeast Spain again. I'd talk about the Catiline conspiracy, but again, we'd be here all day. Anyway, you may be wondering how Caesar managed to get elected to all these positions. As it turns out, he did it by spending lots and lots of money and getting into severe debt, to the point where he couldn't go back to Rome lest his creditors call in their debts on him. See, you weren't allowed to sue people who were in political or military positions for things, so they had to wait until his term was up. Caesar, not wanting to be sued for all his debts, made a deal with a guy named Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was another Roman figure whose biography is long and complicated. Suffice it to say that Crassus was one of Rome's richest and most corrupt men, known for doing things like owning a private fire department and refusing to put out fires unless the person sold him their property first. And yes, there were plenty of charges that he was also the one starting the fires to do this. Still, he was happy to do anything to get in the way of another figure with a giant biography named Pompey, who you'll be hearing a lot more about later. Crassus and Pompey hated each other, mostly because Crassus tended to do all the work and Pompey tended to take all the credit. See, for example, the whole Spartacus debacle, which is yet another person with a story that is too damn long to cover here. Anyway, with his debts covered by Crassus, Caesar was then proclaimed imperator by his troops, which meant that he could have a triumph, the highest of military honors under the Roman Republic. Well, he was supposed to, but Caesar also wanted to run for consul, which is the highest political office in the Roman Republic. The problem was that you weren't allowed to lead troops into Rome, mostly because of that whole Sulla thing. So if you wanted to triumph, he'd have to be a soldier and stay outside Rome. If you wanted to run for election, he'd have to stop being a soldier, but that meant no triumph. This situation will repeat again later. If you're sitting here going, wait, doesn't this happen again later? The answer is yes, but unlike later, this time, Caesar decides that the triumph was less important than the consulship, so he gave up control of the army and returned to Rome. And that's part 1 of Caesar's life. Next time, we'll get into his consulship and military campaigns, which is, again, full of lots of people with extremely long backstories and connections. Great.